So, welcome to Queer Elsewheres, I would say. We have, Abdullah, you're there, right? You're now online with us. And as I mentioned, that this will be a three-way conversation, and we have Imad here with us and Abdullah joining from Toronto. This conversation that we have envisioned between ourselves takes cue from Kadji Amin's invitation, who's a scholar, to think about what meanings might adhere to queer as a term if we were to travel with it. And this already suggests that theoretical concepts and epistemologies that we work with as artists, as thinkers, as researchers, have certain kinds of geographies and histories attached to them. So it's not this kind of universalizing move, but that we have to then unpack them. So what happens when a term such as queer, which is imagined in very specific locations, and we can quite easily say, if you look at queer theory, it's very it has this Anglo-American kind of bias or inheritance. So what happens when we take these terms to other locations? And this is both a question of its reception, but also a question of how do we unpack these concepts if we are to use them. One of the reasons, I think, before we actually introduce our works and then also situate why we're interested in it, is to think why these questions are important to us and why shall we think about these elsewheres. Part of it is because we as creative individuals or people who write, research, make art, or produce discourse, we do so in and from contexts, whether these are national contexts, nation states, or these are transnational contexts through migration or studying or working abroad. A lot of the work that we do, a lot of the archives that we work with, a lot of the histories that we are confronted with do not sit straight with histories of Western scholarship, and in this case, queer studies or queer theory. So in that sense, I think it's important that we talk about the kinds of inheritances, the kinds of references, the kinds of histories that are attached, or the kinds of cultures and societies that come attached to concepts. But then also think about how do we travel with these concepts, so which is the question of its reception in our works. So our idea was that as we come together in this physical/virtual space, because we're also mostly online, we can come together and sort of unsettle perhaps some of the assumptions that theory or queer studies makes, and not least the impression that some cultures or some queer cultures are more amenable to theory and theory making than others. And I think in this way, the kind of thing that we're suggesting through our conversation is that if we are to unpack it, if we are to look for other queer ancestors, if we are to look for other inheritances of queer in other locations, then we might say that queer futures or the future of queer may very well lie elsewhere. Before we get into the conversation, I would like to introduce the panelists and myself as well. My name is Omar Khasmani. I'm a cultural anthropologist working as a postdoctoral associate at the research cluster Affective Societies at Freie Universität Berlin. My own work, or my broader work, pursues critical notions of public intimacy, post-migrant belonging, and ideas of queer temporalities. It's a research practice which can be kind of situated across the study of Islamic life worlds, queer and affect theory, and with a focus on migration and Sufi devotional life worlds. I grew up in Pakistan, and I've been living in Berlin since 2010. Abdullah Qureshi, who's joining us from Toronto, is a Pakistani-born artist, educator, and cultural producer. And within his practice, he's interested in using painting, filmmaking, and methodologies of collaboration to address personal histories, traumatic pasts, and sexuality. Through his ongoing doctoral project, which is titled Mythological Migrations, Imagining Queer Muslim Utopias, he examines formations of queer identity and resistance in Muslim migratory contexts. Abdullah's work has been exhibited internationally, also part of this exhibition, and he has held numerous positions at cultural and educational institutions. He has joined the Center for Feminist Research at York University in 2019 and as a visiting researcher, and is also a doctoral candidate at Aalto University in Finland. Imad Gebrayel, who's sitting right next to me in person, which is quite a rare thing these days, is a Lebanese designer, educator, and researcher based in Berlin. He has produced visual and theoretical works around self-orientalism in Arab design, countermapping, and archiving. He also collaborated with several journalistic platforms exploring common grounds between design and communication. With several years of experience as creative director between Abu Dhabi and Beirut, he has lived in the Netherlands, where he has received a master's degree, and now in Berlin, where he's pursuing a PhD at the Institute of European Ethnology at Humboldt University. He's also the co-founder of this very interesting initiative, the Queer Arab Barty, and hopefully we'll hear about it in the, it's part of the Berlin cultural scene. In his PhD project, which I think is super interesting, he's been looking at the negotiations of Arab-Muslim identifications in the context of Sonnenallee, which is a large avenue or street in Berlin. And he's interested in looking at notions of difference within presumed sameness of Arab immigrant in Berlin, and looks at questions of gender, queerness, class, and memory in relation to the Arab community in Berlin. So I think maybe we can start with diving into one of the questions that we've also discussed earlier, and perhaps maybe I can ask Abdullah to chime in first, so that we can involve this other elsewhere that we have in Toronto. And it's a question to both of you, of course. And I'm interested, I think because I struggle with it, this idea, I'm interested in how you relate to the notion of elsewhere in the context of your own practice, whether it's research, whether it's art, and both of you also sort of work on the intersections of these fields and disciplines. So I'm interested how elsewhere is important, or even what constitutes an elsewhere for you.
Thank you for that introduction, Omar. Yeah, I'll try to dive right into it. And I think the idea of elsewhere is really something that has been coming up a lot more in my work, because I don't think that I understood. I mean, so just taking a step back, I think that for me, I kind of have always grappled with the idea of navigating my queer identity as someone who comes from Pakistan and is operating in Western systems or frameworks. In so many cases, I don't think that there was ever a queer point of reference locally for me. And so when I started coming to terms with my identity, I was either looking at Western visual culture, or later on Western artists and theoretical frameworks. And so increasingly, I think the challenge has been to reconcile these two spaces that at times seem to be oppositional in terms of how they're presented. And of course, not the case, because for many of us who do exist between these two worlds, we are, through our very existences, able to present that alternative. I think the other thing that when we start thinking about elsewhere is that for many of us, let's say in my case, Pakistan, elsewhere is not really elsewhere. It is very much here and now. So I think the question of elsewhere, in quotation marks, is also from recognizing a particular point of reference. When we are in Pakistan, would what the West be an elsewhere, or vice versa, which is mostly the case? And I think that, at least in the context of my own work, to try and work with narratives of queerness from Pakistan, or to situate them more broadly in the context of my doctoral research in a Western sense, is to trouble these spaces, to open them up, to complicate them. I don't think that there is the intention for me to define them, but rather to collectively arrive at some kind of meaning and understanding that would help me kind of understand that further as well.
Would you say something in relation to this question, Imad?
Yeah, I mean, I would second Abdullah as well. I think I'm in a constant negotiation of my elsewhereness in general. I mean, somehow this is like an omnipresent factor in my life. So I'm in different elsewheres. I'm a designer in anthropology and a critical designer in design, and an outsider, I mean, a migrant in Germany, and an outsider insider to the other migrants in Berlin, for example. So, I mean, even currently, I'm physically here, but my mind is also in some sort of an elsewhere. It's with what's happening in Palestine, or with what has been ongoing with different issues in Lebanon. So it seems like being elsewhere is something one cannot avoid. I mean, if we're dealing with identifications like queer and migrant per se, and yeah, I think it's a necessity almost. It feels like a necessity. I don't know, in an affective dimension as well. It feels like something that we need somehow, or a part of our identifications. I mean, this space of a lot of black feminist scholars call it double liminality. So it's this in-betweenness and this elsewhereness. I mean, reflecting on the concept you're proposing. So I'm in a constant influx of elsewheres, I think.
I think it's interesting that there's this kind of meta way to think about elsewheres. I mean, part of it has to do with what Abdullah also mentioned, like the else of what, right? So what is elsewhere always has to do with where you're looking from, or what constitutes as a here, right? So there is this sort of larger global sort of politics attached to at least how I started conceptualizing it, to say, okay, there is a particular way in which theories is produced, made, but also understood, and it has a certain kind of geography. So we can talk about elsewhere in this sort of meta scale, but also the bigger questions of migration, being in the diaspora, or having this or writing about places that we write about, right? Or the art or the work that we create references histories and locations that are not in the global north, perhaps. But then there is also you talked about the affective dimension. There is a very personal way in which we imagine a certain kind of elsewhereness or certain kind of outsiderness, which is rather central to growing up queer wherever. I think doesn't matter if you've grown up in Lebanon, Beirut, Karachi, whatever. So there's a way in which very meta or very micro and macro scales of politics get combined through this notion of the elsewhere. So I wonder if that plays a role in the work that you do. I know, Abdullah, that you work also with the concept of utopia, which is another way of thinking about elsewhere. You also have a notion of the traumatic in your work, right? So that's also a certain kind of foreignness, a certain kind of sense of alienation. So I would ask both of you in a way to think, also then to speak a little bit more about how the personal is also a site of elsewhere, and that sort of shapes the work that you do?
I think in my case, I mean, and the idea of the traumatic past, or even to think about utopias or futures, very much emerges from being in this space of double exclusion. So I think, as someone who grew up in Pakistan, I think by and large, as a younger person, I felt that I didn't belong in that space, and due to the kind of Western representation that I was seeing, very limited, mind you, in the early 90s. I mean, only a handful of references characters on TV. But for some reason, there was this perception that if I am in the West, I would be free, right? I would be able to live the way I want. And when I did become, like when I went to London, UK as a student, that was very much not the case. I felt incredibly out of place. I felt that I wasn't able to crack the code of performing for the white gaze in the proper way, what was expected of me. And as a body of color. And so I think that that is a question that has informed my practice from a personal point of view, but certainly that is something that has also come to my attention, or something that does, or that is something that I think about actively as when the so-called European migrant crisis happened, where we saw waves of immigrants come into Europe, but also we saw LGBT immigrants come as part of that, right? And many of them were escaping gender and sexual-based violence from various contexts, coming in search of freedom that supposedly Europe promised. But then, of course, exclusions manifested in a range of ways, even within queer spaces. In Helsinki, for instance, we saw the two main gay clubs exhibit a very clear pattern of rejecting immigrants who were of certain backgrounds. And yet those immigrants were okay to be consumed and fetishized in legalized cruising spaces, right? And so I think these are the questions of being othered and elsewhere, and kind of finding yourself in dual locations that I'm really interested in, and then using, as an artistic practitioner, using those kind of experiences to then imagine new ways of thinking, imagine new features, imagine new utopias that for us don't seem to exist at the moment.
Yeah, I can build on that, but I want to go a step a bit backwards. I think in my work, it started showing up when I started producing work on self-orientalism, or doing research on that, especially, I mean, starting from my own background or positionality in Lebanon, where different communities think there and elsewheres, if we want to make the link here. So if you come from, for example, in my case, from a Christian household, with a certain Civil War affiliations that are more leaning towards the right, then you believe in a different history, one of plural histories that we negotiate, or we really use as a ground for conflict in Lebanon. So what that produced is a system of differentiation, but of identification with the certain Western or Eurocentric idea, or different cultures, or this very close identification with the colonizer in our case. So a huge part of that community believes that we're not Arab, and that we need to stay at close proximity with Europe, and so on and so forth. But then again, my migration journey kind of put me in those challenges. It has nothing to do with my background, but in a way, like Abdullah said, I came to Berlin 3-4 years ago when things were still, I mean, we're talking about the newcomers, so the refugees, and how this new negotiation of queer spaces, what that meant, how to kind of open those discussions about fetishization, about spaces being exclusive despite them being queer, which is another problem with understanding that concept as well. So we did some, we tried to address that. We tried in the collective you mentioned, the Queer Arab Party. Maybe we can talk about that a bit later. But we tried to address those ideas. Though I have to say something, that it's really important to acknowledge that those very different perspectives on the elsewhere and on queer are very much needed. So this heterogeneity in this conversation is super important and is to be safeguarded and protected.
Yeah, I think there is something that I'm also hearing from you guys, but it's something that I've been struggling with, is to who to think queer with, right? So when I mean, Abdullah, you also mentioned whether it's even television or pop culture references, but I'm thinking more in terms of theoretically speaking. When you read theory and you want to also do that theoretical work from the context that we engage with, in my case, Pakistan, we're confronted with the idea that it's not just that theory is being produced in particular kinds of institutions and promoted by particular kinds of publishing sort of venues, but that it also comes, so it's not just about location in terms of geography. So elsewhere, not only in terms of where you're thinking from, but elsewhere also in terms of temporality, right? So the kinds of places we work from are also seen as temporally backward, right? So they're not just, they come with a certain kind of encumbrance. So in my case, if I could speak about my work, because I deal with not just Pakistan, but I also write about a religious shrine. That's where my earlier work was based, or that's where the book that which is just finished is sort of stemming from. There are these notions that both Pakistan and a religious life world are seen as complete elsewheres, or complete sort of, you can say, foreign to ideas of queer thinking. So how do you start thinking, what kinds of archives, who do you think with? And I know, think part of what Abdullah and my work, what we share is also that we go back to some of the Sufi sort of archives, but not as a way, at least in my case, not as a way to do an apologetic way, you know, of queer thinking, or to recuperate or recover a history, but to say, all right, there is an archive that we can actually instrumentalize to think queer with. And I think that's something that I'm also then interested in, how are there queer ancestors, are there queer histories that we might identify for ourselves? That's one way to also decenter the work that we read, and it's fascinating in its own way. It's not to say that any theory that is produced outside the worlds that we inhabit is uninteresting, right? But it's to think about how can we then also speak for our histories, or how do we find a place for ourselves in that narrative? So is there a way, the question I'm trying to sort of, you know, ask is, what are the resources you guys look at? What are the archives that you revert back to if you want to think queer differently or otherwise, let's say? So maybe we can start with Imad first and then Abdullah.
Yes, I think I align with that vision of trying to build on our own pasts, also our very plural past, because I mean, we also don't come from a very one-dimensional space and time. But I'm also here, I would like to really address the question of archive or TV or popular culture, or with a bit of, we have to be a bit careful. Because a lot of those archives, a lot of those references come with a certain, I mean, within a certain context and time and space as well, temporalities. But also a lot of those queer examples that we grew up with. For example, in Lebanon, we have, as an example that is widely known, a drag performer called Basim Ghali, and they go on TV since the mid-90s, super well celebrated, super well accepted by the mainstream, but only because they do not show up outside the persona. So in a way, they are accepted, and they kind of build most of the queer vocabulary in the region, actually. They are accepted as long as they're not human. So there is no human story to them. So we have to really look at those references a bit critically to problematize some of them. The other side of our archives coming from the Arab-speaking world or the Swana region is can highly be self-orientalized. So it's a lot of reproduction of this colonial memory. So I'm all for digging deep in our histories and our productions while trying to be critical, trying to problematize those productions, and also to understand them contextually within a certain, within the history of the conflicts our regions have been living through.
No, I totally see that point. I think that's exactly why I also think that this move towards the past, which I can understand that there's a desire for, our own ancestors' archives, inheritances, at least in the work that I do, I'm trying to say that it cannot just be recuperative, it cannot be reparative histories of queers, because you can't just always go back and say, and that happens a lot. I think it has happened, at least in the case of people looking at, or scholars looking at Islamic histories from a queer perspective. So far the work is very limited, and it is rather recuperative. It's to say, oh, we were once queer, and I think that's not enough. Not just that it's not enough, it's also not sort of exciting enough as a way to think with. So perhaps, Abdullah, would you care to elaborate on that if you want?
Yeah, I think that in terms of the spaces or archives and things that I look at, I think one of the key strategies has been of collaborating in organization, because certainly I don't think that, like many others, that this is not a singular conversation. This is a collective conversation, and a process or a part of that involves questioning, as Imad is saying, Orientalist narratives, and I think as a result of that. I guess that is in some ways the decolonial process that we can go to get through together. And in some ways, I also look toward people like yourself, Omar, who have extensively been examining Sufi frameworks. In the context of my own work, I think these figures become a point of reference. I don't think that I look at them as once queer, rather trying to sort of identify points of reference outside the current discourse that I'm familiar with, as a way of starting to identify different formats of queerness that may once have existed. And that doesn't mean that we define them necessarily in the same way. So for instance, if I look at or think about Madhul al-Hussein or even Rabi al-Basri, in many cases, they may not kind of encompass queerness the way we understand or live our lives, right? But they certainly took oppositional positions. They took non-heteronormative positions. They went against the grain of what supposedly constituted as mainstream Islam. And that becomes then a way of rethinking history. And so much of how we think about Islamic art that kind of refers to religious and spiritual references has imagination as part of it. So, for instance, one of the notions that I talk about is this concept of the Char Bagh, which is the four gardens that are mentioned in the Quran as heaven, and how that translates into physical architecture in multiple spaces in Ottoman, Persian, and Mughal traditions. So then what is there stopping us to go back and kind of work with these references and start a process of reimagining from the here and now? So I guess that's the way I kind of work with it. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, it also reminds me that I think part of the reason we also came up with this conversation and then invited Imad into it also is Abdullah and I are working on this. Abdullah is involved with a book project that I'm working on where we are looking at various ways of thinking queer histories and queer cultures from Pakistan. It's an edited volume, and Abdullah is also participating in it with a chapter. And one of the ways in which we started thinking about it, it's also a good way to introduce you to this conversation, is I started writing or researching on this idea of the temporal backwardness that is attached to certain locations, and to think about what the suffix stan sort of connotes in places like Pakistan. And in the process, started thinking about stan. So, like in Deutschland, Land is the land. So one can say that Pakistan stands for a concept of place. But if you look into it, it's tied to the Sanskrit word asthana, which means posture. So it's not just a place; it's also a position to speak from. It's a point of view. It's a perspective, and it's connected to the German word stehen and the German word for the city, Stadt. Right. So it's both place and a historical or a position to speak from. And we started to sort of think about what can we do with this notion of for all these places that have this kind of backwardness attached to them. And I think stan is also used, if you see it, it's used as a kind of a derogatory term to attach stan to a term. It already allows you to say that it is a particular kind of location, right? But how do you queer that concept? How do you use that as a way to then think kind of inventively from it? Which is one way to sort of perhaps think about how all this thinking that we're trying to do, the cautions that you've mentioned, both of you, what we should be cautious about, is also then attached to the idea that this kind of thinking that we're trying to do also brings with it certain hopes, right? So the question is, in some ways, what are we hoping to achieve by doing this kind of work? Thinking queer from unlikely places, thinking queer from historical locations that are not necessarily seen as sites of theory making or sites of thinking or intellectual, abundance, let's say. So my question to you would be, in your projects, in your practices, what are you trying to achieve by thinking, let's say, queer otherwise? If that's not too grand a question, but still.
It is, but we can try, I guess. Yeah. Well, I don't see it as a separate concept to start with. So I see it as one of many intersections of discrimination, and I see that reclaiming it or working with it or redefining it is a part of decolonizing knowledges that were kind of produced about us, not with us. And I see that taking ownership of our own histories, our own stories, even in the now, claiming space, claiming discourse, the whole thing is a part of queering, is a queering process. So for me, I don't see it as a separate act in what I do, and that also shows in my PhD research. I don't necessarily deal with it as queer, as a separate concept, but I deal with it within the umbrella of gender and of negotiations. So that's how I deal with it. It's omnipresent. It's something that isn't separate.
Would you say a little more about this project, your PhD project? Because I think it's a very interesting thing. What you're talking about is to think of queer in a more capacious way, right? To say that, okay, I'm interested in this kind of, let's say, landscape of thinking, but I don't necessarily need to use the term.
Yeah.
So you're pushing beyond, let's say, the straight of what is straight in queer in some ways. So perhaps you could say a little more about the ethnographic context or the field research you're doing, so that, yeah, we get a more concrete sense.
Yeah, I mean, to build on that and then tell you a bit more about the project, I see it as, I mean, from the lens of Gayatri Gopinath, which, I mean, it's the queer diasporic framework. It's very much a parallel to how queer is perceived as a lower class or like as inferior to the heterosexual. The diasporic is perceived as inferior to the nation. So I see them quite entangled, and I don't see them separate. In the process of my research, I look into, it is ethnographic and it is about a street, but it's not urban anthropology or urban ethnography. What I'm dealing with is the affective dimension that lies in the different memories of those very different groups. I mean, they're all Arab per se, which is another point of negotiation, but they're all very different groups culturally. Also, they're different in the way they came here, when they came here. They're different across the board. I mean, I'm not going to go in details, but we have to start the discourse from difference and track it back in those little pockets in memory, which aren't usually discussed. For example, I mean, it's also a historical fact, that there has been huge conflicts between the Lebanese and the Palestinians in Lebanon, and one of the results is the Palestinian migration after the ethnic cleansing in Lebanon, I mean, after the ethnic cleansing in Israel in '48. So this conflict was never addressed in migration, because when you migrate, you become the migrant, yeah? You become the Arab migrant, as if you're one category. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to discuss those conflicting memories to try and debunk this idea that we're one thing. Whatever that means, it might lead to more conflict, but it might lead to more just understanding of us as plural and multiple and diverse. So this is what I'm trying to do. It's quite difficult to do memory ethnography, but I have the intention.
No, I think it's super interesting. I think one of the things we wrote in the concept for the panel when we were discussing with Benjamin was also to, I think one of the things we wrote was, is queer history always a history of LGBTQIA rights, or can we think of a history of queerness more capaciously? Can we desire a history that is more capacious and which allows otherwise ways of being in the world to be sort of brought into the frame? And I think somehow I have this impression, Abdullah, you could correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, from what Imad has described and from what I do in my work on a religious shrine in Pakistan, somehow we are working with queer frameworks, but we are not working necessarily with queer identities. I'm not writing about gays and lesbians in Pakistan. I'm not interested in that conversation somehow. I'm not saying that the people who are interested in reconciling faith and sexuality are, I'm not saying that that's not an important concern. It's not a concern intellectually for me, right? So it doesn't matter if I write about a shrine. And this is the kind of bias that disciplines prepare us for, right? So if you look at anthropology of Islam, it's really not interested in queer methods, sensibilities, or queer theory for that matter. And if you look at queer studies, they're not really looking at religious life worlds as abundantly or as, so in a way, when I try to, when I think that the kind of work I'm trying to do is really, is between disinclined analytical objects, right? But what I'm trying to say is that we are trying to work with queer as a capacious hermeneutic, which goes beyond the question of just LGBTQIA politics. So perhaps that's also a way to then, Abdullah, for you to also talk about some of the work that you're doing. I think because you have this interesting, there is some of your work which, for example, the chapter you're writing about Anwar Saeed's work in Pakistan, which does deal with queerness in its sexual terms. But then you're also working with this question of the utopia. So I'm just saying that, is there a way in which your work also aligns with the kind of descriptions of queer that we've just discussed?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, I mean, in agreement with you, I think I would also say, I think there is resistance on our part to define what queerness means in terms of the LGBT community in Pakistan, let's say, but more kind of interrogate the complexity of that, because as we know that there isn't a singular way of being queer or LGBTIQA from Pakistan or anywhere, right? There's no way to kind of set a parameter. And I think for that reason, I think there's a caution on our part as cultural practitioners or academics to produce work that has that danger, where somehow we encapsulate a community, because in so many ways, a singular project cannot do that, you know? And I think furthermore, I would say that the way we engage with history or the past, there's a further caution to go into it with I wouldn't say fresh eyes, but kind of like an openness that is not or that is aware of the Western influence and tries to sort of stay clear of it. So there isn't a process of discovery. It's not like, you know, in the past and for the first discovering potentially queer figures, right? So I think these are the kind of inform creative process as well as our intellectual process. Yeah, I think I would say that in terms of my project, did you want me to talk about anything specifically? I can elaborate that if you want.
No, I mean, sorry, you want to say something?
No, I can just add something to that. I'm also super hesitant to work with concepts that my field, let's call it, that my field wouldn't necessarily identify with. So even if we go linguistically in Arabic, there is no translation for queer. We translated queer. So somehow the concept feels very imported. And I feel very hesitant to work with it as well, even though it has potentials, yeah? So we used it for Queer Arab Party for the exact reason, because we didn't want to say LGBTQ AI+. We wanted to be, of course, more inclusive, but we also wanted to use a term that would fly above the heads of those who might cause problems. So in a way, trying to bring that academic discourse on queerness can be a way out, yeah? It can reach a certain target audience, it can protect as much as it can harm. But my hesitations also come from the fact that the concept itself is very much in its current form, not existent in our cultures, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point to think about the term's reception, but also its, let's say, it's strategizing, right? So it's a way to cleverly use it to perhaps evade some of the attention, to maybe also use it as an inclusive term, but also then to, this doesn't mean, I mean, using or adopting the term doesn't mean that we have to be uncritical about it or that we have to accept it like, or embrace it without any reservation. And I think there is this kind of, but I think there's also that queer allows us to then, to do something with it that probably terms like gay, lesbian, and those identitarian terms don't allow us, right? So there is all this. I think I'm also aware that when we were doing this, both when we organized this conference called Queer Futures in Lahore at LUMS in Pakistan, and also with the volume that Abdullah is also contributing to, I was very aware that people apply the term in various ways, and we didn't want to sort of, let's say, prescribe, a definition, or we were open to people critiquing it. We were open to people rejecting it. I mean, both in the book and the conference as well, that people can come to the term in their own ways, use it improperly, inadequately, and I think that is where perhaps, at least in my view, where the hope lies, right? It's not to find a translation necessarily. It's not necessarily always to say, but we have our own term, which we do, and it's fine. But then also, how do we, the idea of not constantly coming up with a new term, but then to speak back requires that we take a term that has been used to describe us, as you were saying, Imad, and then to see what we can do with it, to trouble it, to unsettle it, to find other histories for it. To basically give a different affective volume to the term so that we may use it. We may use it or abuse it in a way, right, intellectually speaking. I wanted to just check in terms of time, if there, Benjamin, if there are any urgent questions or that you want us to respond to or something, or we can then wrap up also.
Well, there are questions coming in actually.
Okay.
Abi Tariq, who had a performance just yesterday night, he had an interesting and important point of view. He's asking about the role of women in the peripheral queer conversation, and aligned with that, if there's a lack of gender diversity on this panel.
Yes.
Thanks, Abi.
Does anyone want to respond?
Very much so, the lack of gender diversity. I think we are all three of us are discussing the term from our own work, and therefore we cannot speak for another group, but for sure, we cannot understand queer without understanding stories of women, trans people, non-binary folks, definitely.
Yeah, and I think also this, it's certainly a very valid point in criticism. And I think the spirit of the conversation is also, the idea to think more capaciously is also then to go beyond the ways in which it is understood in hegemonic ways, and that certainly includes other perspectives, for sure. Is there something else that we can respond to or take it?
Yeah, there will be another one raised by Emma. She asks, why is queerness easier to accept as a performative act or persona from the general public? I think that goes back to the example you had, Imad, with the drag queen.
I don't necessarily have the answer of why, but I think if we want to go a bit very subjectively, being a thread requires having some sort of a responsibility or story or power, and when you're not human enough in that example, then you're not necessarily a threat. But I also have to say that it's a multi-layered experience. The drag performer I talked about, Bassem Fkhali, because you can understand this art if you're a kid, if you're an adult, if you're a homophobe, and if you're queer in various ways. And that drag performer had a Fawazir show during Ramadan. So, this is a very high level of acceptance by the mainstream. But what I was trying to say is that it is problematic to understand this experience as a queer experience because this isn't how the mainstream understood it. So we have to be a bit critical with that. But of course, it has all the possibilities of being understood as a queer experience. A lot to learn from, actually.
Thank you. More? Yeah, actually, well, it's a similar question, which you just try to answer retrospectively, maybe. But how do you see it perspectively? How do you see the the relations between gender identity and performativity, in the future elsewhere, where perhaps the idea of a body is multiple rather than singular.
I mean,
I don't know
it's interesting.
Who wants to take that on?
Yeah. I mean, with queer and also with ideas of elsewhere, I mean, it's not, as we were trying to say, that it's not just a question of geography. It's also, one can also think in transhuman ways. One can think about elsewhere or queer elsewheres as something which is beyond us in time, which is beyond us in form. So also in the anthropomorphic kind of sense as well. Trans-species, transhuman, the question of digital elsewheres, the question of robotic, technological kind of transmutations. So it does allow for that kind of thinking, I would say, to be included in such perspectives.
Yeah, that is pretty much what she also insinuates in her next comment. I actually have a question here from Philip Zimmer, standing next to me, who was on a panel yesterday. So I hand on the microphone.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting, enlightening talk. And I'm trying to grapple a little bit with two kind of, let's say, propositions you've made. This one is the decolonizing of the history, actually, of the term queer. But here we deal with a very wide conundrum and all kind of, let's say, affirmative struggles. Is similar in feminism with this, and we have this debate in Pakistan as well about feminism being imported in the same way. We have the debate about queer being imported and comes along in English with certain kind of power structures, with hegemonies, and if you look at the realities, the lived realities of people who are defining themselves as queer under the notion of queer in Pakistan, for example, that has then very often is linked to class. So it's intersecting with certain kind of cultural capital and ways to express and display yourself. So, and we know from Dave Nazagi's work also in India that there are different terms for transgender and for different, and there's Koti and Hijra and Khwaja Zara and whatnot. There's different localized terms, and but there's the problem of how to integrate these into kind of this narrative of queer history. So I think this is the first part, and the second one is, I think, what you said about kind of using the term queer in a more also creative way and not necessarily bound to a sexual identity, but also to queering things. And I think I know a little bit about your work with Lal Shabazz Qalandar, and I think I have the idea what you mean with what they do when they queer the Qalandar. But I would like to be interested to hear a bit more about that aspect of your work as well.
Okay. Yes, I did not talk about my work in concrete ways, that is true. I think one of the ways in which, do you want me to, I mean, the two questions are quite different, right? Like
separate.
Yeah, sure. So maybe to start with the second one first, the idea of thinking queer more capaciously, as I would say, is to then think about what are the unstraight worlds that we can read through the notion of queer without tying them to questions of identitarian politics, right? So in that sense, my work looks at the ways in which people's intimate relations with a religious object, place, or figure allows them to inhabit but also mobilize unstraight possibilities of life. So it's a way to think. It's a way to think about queerness in relation as arising out of a religious, not just a religious context, but a religious, almost a religiously understood form of relating. And that's, I think, that's what I'm trying to do in the sense that it then speaks back to the ways in which we understand queerness, right? It speaks back to the ways in which we can sort of untether queerness from its particular genealogies. So it's really like, it's a troubling, that's what one can do. And I think it's to say that that unless we try and think from unlikely locations, unless we try and think queer in these broad terms, we will not be able to unpack what we have. But I think the first question that you asked in terms of people's access to terms and terminologies, people's, I think it's a valid point that queer, in terms of people who use it sort of actively, do come from particular socio-economic sort of, who has access to that politics is already a question of class in Pakistan.
And can I, sorry, I was going to
Please.
add to that if that's okay?
Yes, please.
I was going to say that I was really interested in the first question and thinking about feminism or the history of feminism in Pakistan as an imported term as well. I think that presents us a very exciting way to then think about what's happening in terms of the queer discourse, in terms of how it's manifesting in the Pakistani context. So I think a prominent moment in the feminist history of Pakistan was the 80s, when there was an Islamic dictatorship and we saw protests take place, and how that also fed and informed the cultural sector, in the sense that there was a women's artist manifesto written by women artists who were in Pakistan, who in secret took kind of like an oath to inform the cultural practice, the educational sectors, and various spaces where they could work through resistance, right? And how these kind of histories then of the Women Action Forum protesting now connects with Aurat March, and how it is and though the media will portray it otherwise, what is exciting about the women marches that are happening today in Pakistan, they do have a larger class representation. There are people from privileged spaces that are fighting for the rights of women who may be working, who otherwise may not be allowed that time off to get them, to get the institutions to send them to this protest, to have their voices represent. So I think there is this exciting momentum in terms of that movement. And I think with queerness, we don't have that movement in the same way. But what we're having now are lots of conversations, whether in the form of conferences or whether in the form of student resistances in art colleges or universities at large. So I think that is something that time will tell. In terms of the gender question, I would like to address that too a little bit, in the sense that certainly this panel could have been more diverse. But again, I would say that we shouldn't see these conversations in isolation, or we shouldn't see the fact that the three of us are speaking about queerness as entirely the discourse, right? It's just our three perspectives. And I would point towards a conversation that I organized towards the end of last year as part of my doctoral dissertation. I'm hoping to make it available, the recording available online soon. But it was also called Queerness Elsewhere. And it had three young people from Pakistan who identify as either non-binary or as women. And then I think that these conversations then have to kind of be seen in that sense. We can't have the burden that these are the first conversations happening, or the only conversations that are happening, certainly.
That's a really good point, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. There's also a question by Jürgen Scharflechner with a little bit I'm going to read because it's a couple of questions.
Okay.
And I think it kind of also links up to what I had asked in the beginning, and maybe it turns out a bit differently. So he writes, Butler in the 90s already talked about the contingent foundations of the category woman. She points out the epistemic force of the term and also its violent implications for feminism. So number 2, does queer have to be treated in a similar way? Probably. What would be a way to ensure its emancipatory power? And what can ethnography contribute here? And it goes even on, but I think these are too many. Let's see.
Would you, Imad, would you like to respond, or?
I mean, again, assuming that, assuming a response to that puts me in a position that would understand queerness as a separate thing again, and I don't. I would say take whatever you want from the concept. Yeah. Just don't use it. But there is a danger. I mean, we've seen it happen to decolonization. Don't use it as a metaphor for something else. So don't queer the hamburger snack on the road. Don't queer the taxi, whatever. But let's also not safeguard those concepts as if they are realities. A lot of those concepts live in books and in academic contexts, which are highly colonial as well. So we have to be also a bit loose with that. There is no checklist. Contrary to queer spaces, there is no checklist. So you don't have to be out or white passing or middle class or blah blah to use a concept. But you can go and run with it. It is something that is dynamic, changing, not constant, for you to queer as well. So.
And I think it is already, I think the way we use it, or the way we envision the conversation, already starting from Kadji Amin's idea that what happens when you travel with queer. And I think what he's trying to do, or the kind of conversation he's trying to invite, is to use queer very contingently, is to say that it is that slick object, right? It's this kind of, and he literally, to almost cite him, he says, what meanings might adhere to queer if we were to travel with it? So it already says that you can see it as a kind of either a slick or a slippery or an empty object, and you can take it and make it mean differently. And I think this is also what we are trying to do with our, and I think in that sense, ethnography, this question of the ethnography plays a huge role. That you can use the space of the ethnography then to talk about alternate imaginaries that might attract or might be able to travel with your concept. I mean, concepts are, as Imad is also trying to say, these are not realities. These are things that we make up and we make do as we go along. And ethnography then is that journey through which you can make a concept travel. And I think that is the kind of thing we're trying to do with the idea of the elsewhere, in a way, right? Or we're trying to open up that conversation to say, what happens when you travel with these concepts? How do you receive them? Where do you take them? And that's the kind of probably hope attached to it.
Thank you, Omar. I think we can probably wrap it up because YouTube is gonna break if not. Maybe just inviting you for some summarizing words, or asking Abdullah and Imad, bringing it back to the exhibition. Maybe what do you think is the emancipatory power of art in both visual arts and design? And could art possibly bring us closer to an elsewhere?
Abdullah, you're muted.
Sorry. I was saying that I don't know. I guess that's a difficult question. But I could speak a little bit about the paintings in this exhibition, and the fact that they come from. I mean, I guess my practice has various aspects to it. There is this kind of research-oriented part of it, which is my doctoral project, Mythological Migrations, which is the position I spoke from mostly in this panel. And I think as a painter, the way I approach art is from the personal, from the autobiographical, people who are part of my circle, people that I'm interacting with in intimate ways. And so, yeah, so I think, so that is what the paintings are coming from. My aesthetic as a painter is very much rooted in the abstract expressionist tradition and how the modernist movement took place in Pakistan. So those are the trajectories that I build upon formally. So that's a slightly different conversation then, but I think that the exciting thing for me as a painter is that then it allows me to take that personal subjective position as well, to tell my individual story, tell my experiences and express that, as well as have a larger collective conversation through other modes of practice.
Mm-hmm. That's a bit of a wound here, because the potential, the emancipatory potential of art, as long as art is an exclusive thing that needs a certain privilege or a certain system for access, so as long as a lot of the art we are dealing with nowadays is not accessible, I don't see a big emancipatory potential. So I see the ground for anything, including queer or emancipatory arts. The key to all that is access, even to language, even to the language we use today. We have to make those discourses accessible, those spaces accessible, those artworks accessible. Otherwise, we will still be, as artists and designers and other knowledge producers within the arts, we will still be perceived as experimental, self-expression, blah, blah, let them play. So as long as we don't address that, nothing will change. So no emancipation without access.
Did I see a hand here? I mean, you didn't. Okay. So I think, yeah, then it's a good time to wrap this up. And I wish to thank, the organizers, of course, Benjamin and the team, the curators, and both Abdullah, you for joining us from Toronto, and Imad, you for being here. I'm glad to also take this conversation forward in the future, but thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you for having me.
No, you're welcome, and thank you for being here as well.